Hello, everybody. My name is Jess Matley. I'm the VP of Program and Event Operations here at Ellevate Network, and very excited to have two special guests with us today for our topic, and really, really thrilled that you could all join us. I'm going to get through some housekeeping real quick. So we like to keep these conversations really interactive. If you feel comfortable keeping turning your camera on, please do, but no pressure. We will kick things off with a presentation from our special guests. And then, as with every roundtable that we host, we'll be going into breakout rooms, small breakout rooms with, say, 3 to 4 other attendees. And this is where you can really contextualize what you've heard. You can bring it to your lives. What's going on? What have you seen work? And really kind of brainstorm peer to peer. What are some actionable steps that you each can take to move the progress forward? So we'll have presentation piece for about 20-25 minutes, then breakout rooms for about 20-25 minutes, and then we'll come back right at the end just for some group share back, sort of final thoughts before we close at the top of the hour. Please use the chat as much as you like, and yeah, that's pretty much it. Other than I'll be recording the presentation piece, please know that your breakout room conversations and share back at the end are not recorded, confidential spaces and safe spaces. Awesome. Okay. So without further ado, let me hand over to our special guests. Today we are joined by Sarah Cottle, who is the SVP Global Head of Data and Insights at S&P Global Market Intelligence, and Dan Sandberg, who is the Managing Director, Head of Quantamental Research and Solutions at S&P Global Market Intelligence. So I'm going to hand over to you two, and thank you so much for joining us today for this important conversation.
Thank you so much, Jess, and to the whole of the Ellevate team for inviting us. I hope that we don't see the numbers start dropping off when people hear about data and quantamental and some of those things. I never thought I would have a career in data. It sounds awfully dry, but actually it's really, really quite interesting. It's very exciting. It's really where data technology, AI is meeting, and that convergence, I think, is going to be enormously impactful into the way that the world shakes out. And one of the wonderful things with data is the ability to derive insights. And some of the insights that we derive, we are very excited to see the results. Other times we will derive research and we don't really like the outcome of the research that we see. So we're going to talk a little bit about some findings that Dan and his team have created for us. But before we get into the actual research, I wanted to do a little bit of an introduction to myself. I have been with S&P Global now for nearly 13 years. I started in London with a relatively small team. I've worked in Singapore and Canada, and now I have a very large team in the market intelligence division, running a business that we call Data and Insights. So it's one of the larger business lines in our market intelligence division. And it is an absolute privilege to lead these few thousand people through some of the most exciting times for our industry at the moment. Going back just a little bit, sort of how did I get to where I am? As I said at the outset, I didn't wake up when I was a teenager and say, the first thing I can think of is I want a career in data. That was definitely not the way I was thinking. I was very attracted to, journalism, but of the exciting kind, right? Sort of war correspondent, foreign correspondent. Those of you who know what goes on in the UK might have heard of a woman called Kate Adie. I guess she's our Christian Amanpour or something, and that was sort of where I thought my career might go. And I did start my career as a journalist, and I spent a few years covering commodity markets in Asia, and it gave me the opportunity to travel and do some of those exciting things, spending time in Nigeria and Kazakhstan and some of the countries that you wouldn't necessarily visit if you weren't doing that for work with a real purpose behind it. After a while being a journalist in the financial B2B space, I realized that actually I wanted to kind of organize the people around me. I could see more efficient ways and better ways of doing what we were doing. So I became a leader of content creators. And I say content creators because it's a good generic term for people who are journalists or analysts. Ultimately we're creating content. And after a few years of doing that, what I really wanted to move into was running the business. So how do we take all that great organization that we've created around the work people are doing and drive more efficiency, more profitability, and more revenue from that? So I see that as three stages in my career: sort of active journalist, manager of content creators, and then leader of a business that creates content. I've done that on three continents. So I've worked in Singapore for 12 years, in Canada, in France, and I'm coming to you now from the UK. It's surprisingly dark and cold here. I just have a very bright light in my office, so you hopefully can still see me here. Companies I've worked for, I don't know if there's any alumni on the call from any of these companies: Dow Jones, Bloomberg, Reed Elsevier, and CNBC while I was in Asia. So one of the things that is so exciting about the work we do, and it's been a theme through my whole career, is the importance of understanding what's going on in the outside world. So, what are the big macro trends? What are the conflict risks? What are some of the areas where, we need to understand the way that the world is being shaped for our customers and for us? That includes technology and economics and many other big themes that we have to really be able to assimilate and communicate into the organization, because that is what ultimately drives the strategy. And it's probably the part of the work that I love most: assimilating all those external trends and understanding what is the information I have to take to create a vision for the business, a strategy, and then ultimately to execute and communicate and get people excited about that direction. So that's a little bit of a themes around my career, that I have absolutely loved. The work is intensely fascinating. I'm also on the board now of the World Economic Forum um, risk report. So we're looking at what are the big risks in the world and how do we create something that can be put in front of the world leaders at Davos in January and really help them to navigate their agenda for just figuring out the world's challenges. So it's exciting work. As I said, sometimes the research tells us great things and we look ahead in the world with optimism and we feel really inspired by what we're seeing and the direction the trends are going. The research that we want to share with you today, please don't sign off, but it's not the best news, right? We're seeing that we've made great progress in the world with women moving into the C-suite and into those senior roles, but the data is showing us that there's been a drop off. And it's incredibly disappointing for those of us, and I assume because you're on this call, we're like-minded, who want to see women elevated, who want to see women in the C-suite, and who want to see that change come. And I think that Dan is going to present to us really the background to the research and how we got to those conclusions. And then we're going to take it into a bit of a discussion about this being, in my mind, a sort of rallying call or a call to action where we need to take what we're seeing as soon as possible, as early as possible, and kind of motivate ourselves to rally around that and make sure that we're doing whatever we can to reverse what we don't want to become a trend. So with that, I'm really delighted to hand over to Dan Sandberg, who's on my team running some incredibly helpful analyses and digging into all kinds of topics. I'll let him describe a little bit his role and the research that he's done.
Thank you, Sarah. Really appreciate it. Pleasure to be here, folks. I am sharing my screen. Hopefully, you guys can see that. And I will jump right in. First, by way of introduction, again, Dan Sandberg. I oversee our quant research team for the data and insights part of the business under Sarah. On the data side, we can, which is the top three boxes of this slide here, we can think of, the S&P value add as providing clients, both with access to proprietary content, but also enriching publicly available information through cleaning, linking, and structuring so that it can then be easily piped into workflows for analysis. Sometimes, that's good enough. having access to structured data. Clients know what they need to do with it. They know how to do it. And we can leave it there, leave it to them. But I'd say in the majority of cases, clients are not just looking for data, they're also looking for insights. And so the insights require visualizations, it requires storytelling, it requires models that can produce actionable takeaways. And that's where my team comes in. We operate in many ways like an internal client of S&P. I myself was a buy-side quant portfolio manager before joining S&P, and most of my senior team has buy-side experience. So we tend to think like a buy-side client, but we do all kinds of thought leadership with, the end goal of helping our clients to find data-driven solutions to their challenges. S&P has always been a forward-thinking organization that prioritizes equity. And my team has been active in thinking of ways we can contribute to that conversation by using our data for good. And so jumping into the research, our most recent work on the subject uses our professionals data set. So we collect information from all of the company's regulatory filings, and we, from that information, can determine who their executives are. We collect from proxies, from something called a Def 14A, and from 10Ks and press releases. Using that information, we've created a database that includes information on 5 million professionals back to 1992. We have board and company affiliations. We have the executives' biographies, standardized job functions, titles, education, and compensation. As long as it's disclosed in a regulatory filing, we've basically got it in the database. For this particular work, we focused on 86,000 executives across 7,300 U.S. firms over 13 years, basically the U.S. equity market, publicly traded companies. And for each executive, we use the executive's biography, which is typically included in the press release when they announce the new executive has been appointed, and we counted the pronouns, he, him, his, she, her, hers, and we used those pronouns to take a best guess on the gender of the executive. It's not a perfect process, but we did some spot checking, and we think that it does what we need it to do in terms of understanding where the trends are going. A lot more to say there, but I'll leave it there for now unless there are questions, which I'm happy to take. Once we've made the assessments, we can then look at year-on-year changes in the representation of each gender within that set of executives disclosed in regulatory filings. And that's what you've got on the screen here, the year-on-year change for each year. DEI progress, basically, what this shows is DEI progress in 2023 was disappointing relative to the recent history. The growth in women's representation across senior positions slowed to the lowest level that we've seen in the last 10 years. And women actually lost seats in the C-suite positions for the first time over the study period going back to 2006. Now, we started monitoring and publishing on these trends back in 2019. And at that time, we said, if you look at the data up to 2019, we said this increasing growth rate in representation that we've been seeing could have really substantial implications for when we might see parity in representation. When are we going to get to this 50-50, in terms of the number of seats held by executives in the United States? And so the increasing rate matters. Why does the increasing rate matter? A lot of studies will take a very simplistic approach. They basically say, how much farther do we have to go? And then how much progress did we make last year? And let's just divide one by the other. So, if we're at 20% representation, that implies we have 30% to go to get to 50-50. If we only added 0.2% last year, well, 30% over 0.2% comes out to 150 years. That's the typical approach. And there's some merit to that, but it is kind of back of the napkin. If the rate of increase is also continuing to increase every year, if we're getting faster and faster growth, if we're building momentum, then the numbers actually change quite substantially. And so you've got actually two projections for two different models on two different years. Hopefully it's clear in this representation. So you got four lines. The two from 2022 are in gray. The two from 2023 are in blue. And you'll notice that one line assumes that the rate of increase just continues to increase faster and faster until we get to parity. The other line assumes that we continue this rate of increase, then it becomes kind of linear, and then we start to see a trail off. Okay, so those are the two models that we posited back in 2019, and we've been following this trend to see whether the data is going to follow one versus the other, or maybe it's somewhere in between. The first model being very aggressive and making some assumptions that bring us to parity very, very quickly. The other model far more conservative and pushing the parity projection out a bit further. So in our original work, we hypothesized that the growth rate probably won't continually increase until we get to parity. It'll probably be something closer to the second model. As we're making progress, as we get closer to the goal, the growth rate will probably sort of slow down to the point where we now reach this sort of steady state equilibrium. And so we wanted to know at what point does that happen. So if 2023 was an aberration, and this accelerated growth picks back up for 2024, then 2023 is sort of a minor issue in my opinion. But if it's an inflection point and the growth rate is going to be lower for longer, if we're going to return to growth rates that we saw pre-2010, then there's a more impactful implication. Then we're going to be pushing that projection out much, much further. And so on one hand, we have this hypothesis that the slow DEI progress is attributable to an aberration, some sort of exogenous factor impacted 2023. 2023 was a bad year, but really the trend is going to pick back up where it left off. And then on the other hand, we have this more alarming alternative hypothesis that the attention on this problem is starting to wane, and that we're actually going to either stall out on progress, or in the case of the C-suite positions, we actually took a step backwards in 2023. And if that continues, feasibly, we never get to parity. And so in an attempt to disentangle this a little bit, we looked at how much are executives talking about DEI issues on their earnings calls. That's what you're looking at in this chart. And so we did this with a process, we call it natural language processing. It's the ability of using computers to monitor regular conversational language. And you can see that this topic, measured with this process, it peaked during the COVID pandemic, where women were disproportionately impacted. A number of studies have shown that. And then it's been on the decline since. And we've actually seen the subject getting very little attention towards the end of 2023. Most of this information is released in annual filings, which tend to come out in the first and beginning of second quarter of the year. So we will be updating the work next year, but in the meantime, we don't really have the full picture until that new information comes in. This is my last slide, and maybe while I'm just talking through this last slide here, we can bring up a polling question. And I'll read through that polling question once it comes up, just so we can all take a look at it. That polling question is: rate your organization's progress in making headway in having more balanced gender executive leadership. Top choice: action is being taken and communicated. Second, we are making progress, but it's slow and minimal. Third, no action. We have a lot of work to do. So as you're filling that out, I just wanted to also point out, in some previous work, we also took a look at compensation. So representation is important, but if there's not fair compensation, then we're not really getting equity. In this other piece, and I'm not going to go too deep into it, we looked at the tendency of executives to be paid near the median. And what we ended up finding was that women in executive roles are more likely to receive salaries that are near the median for their position, tenure, and company sector, whereas men are more likely to be paid much more than that or a little bit less than that. And you might think, well, at least we're not, sort of, at least I'm not in the, the side that's below the median. But I'll explain to you a little why this is ultimately unfair, in mass. The reason is probably best explained with an analogy. Imagine if you were sitting down to a meal, 3 people, and at one table, all 3 people were to order a $10 salad. The average price of the meal at that table is $10. The median price at that table is $10. At another table, you have 3 people. One person orders a, $1 bowl of ramen noodles or something. One person orders the $10 salad, and one person orders a $100 steak dinner. That table, right, in aggregate has now a $111 tab, but the median is still $10. The other table has an aggregate bill of $30 and a median of $10. This is what's happening with compensation. There has been a lot of focus on the median, which is a good measure of central tendency. I'm not trying to say medians are a bad way to measure things, but they don't tell the whole story. When you're only looking at the median, you're only looking at that middle value. And what's happening is the whole table of women that are receiving compensation, that table is getting less relative to the table of men over time, even though that the medians of the 2 tables are being brought in line. The check for that table is still much lower. I'll leave it there. Happy to take any questions, and thank you very much for the opportunity to share the work.
Well, Dan, thank you. I think thank you. As I sort of introduced this session, I told you you weren't necessarily going to love the findings of the research, but I think in a way that just really highlights the value of it. If we don't have people digging in and questioning the numbers that are coming across our desks, we're missing out. So just to look at the poll here, we've got, well, fairly balanced between the first 2 options. Action is being taken and communicated at 44%, slow progress at 52%, and fortunately not too much of the no or little action at 4%. But I think still, if you take those top 2 responses there, it's still disappointing to see the slowness in the results. So I'm hoping that the conversations that we're going to get into in a minute will get us all inspired to try and move that needle to more on the top line. But I know that Dan just gave us quite a bit of information, and some of it's quite technical for those of us who are not quants and mathematicians and so on. So, I'm very happy for you to take a little minute to chat to Dan and see if you have any questions that you might want to ask him.
Yes, and feel free to come off camera or come on to audio for those questions.
Thank you so much, Dan. I actually chatted this question as well. But can you speak a bit more to the correlation between DEI and women and some of the assumptions that you're making there and how there is that clear connection? I was right with you until we started talking into that DEI correlation.
So I think, and I would defer to the expertise of the others on the call here, but my understanding is that diversity, equity, and inclusion encompasses, a number of initiatives, to promote and correct cases where there are underrepresentation within certain groups. And I think, the DEI focus does sit adjacent to the representation of women and in executive roles. Certainly, it's not the sole force, right? Just because executives are not focusing on that on earnings calls does not mean that it's not receiving attention. But as far as data sets that give us a proxy for how much this is top of mind, I thought that was, sort of a low-hanging fruit that we could do that analysis. Were there other, did that address it, or were there other sort of concerns that you had there as far as assumptions?
I think that sort of touches on it. I've seen a lot of slate requirements in both DE upfront when on HR teams from an HR perspective in hiring, where you need to have a certain number of gender interviewees or candidates, similar DEI candidates, and women seems to fall a little bit outside of DEI, so that's why I was, I guess, a little bit surprised to see that, but interesting to see how that's being used. And thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate that. I'll look into that more.
Thanks for that, Dan. I think certainly at S&P Global, when we talk about our DEI agenda, and I'm sure this differs by organization, by geography, and so on, we're certainly thinking about our commitment to ensuring that women are getting the same and equal opportunities to anyone else in the organization. I would say that broadly. We have an organization within S&P called WINS, which is the Women's Network. I spent a year being chair of that network when I was based in Asia, and it's a phenomenal resource. So we really do use the voice of the women in that organization to ensure that the needs of women, the voice of women are being represented, but also we really encourage allies into that organization too. Although it's a women's network, it's not exclusively there for women, but that's how we ensure that, there's always some I would say light being shone onto that as a question. And we're very fortunate we have a very senior executive sponsor in our WINS organization, which is in what date is it today? We have just about a week until Martina Chung is announced as our CEO, as takes on a role as CEO. She's already been announced. And so, we're very, very proud to have her as our WINS sponsor for the time being. So we do put a lot of focus on that. I did see there's another question around gender pay gap. Now, in terms of the research, I'm not sure that there's a recommendation as such that's come out of it, but I think we can certainly chat about that as we go into the breakout rooms. But I think the research that you just described, Dan, shows when you consider these the mean way of measuring, there is certainly some sort of disparity that's coming out of that way of measuring our compensation.
That's right. Actually, we discussed this a bit in the paper, Glass Floors and Ceilings. So I'd be happy to get it really deep into the weeds offline if anybody's interested in doing that. To address the question, I would say it really depends on how you're doing the measurement. And I think that, inadvertently or intentionally, there has been a lot of management of this metric around median compensation. And we actually coined the term in the paper, gender-based compensation management, or GBCM. And I think that that metric, what is measured is managed, right? So I think that metric does get a lot of attention. That does not, just because that metric is in line, does not mean that there is no pay gap.
Thanks, Dan. So I think we are ready to go into our small groups and have a conversation. And one of the goals, I think, of getting people together into smaller groups here is to start thinking about, okay, this is where we are. We are always happy to share more deeply the methodology behind the work that we've done. But I think the purpose of these discussions is, if this is indeed the situation we find ourselves in, what are some of the things that we might want to do, and how can we get inspired to put a stop to that decline, right? To make sure that that trend doesn't become a trend and it reverses. So I would love it if, Jess, you can help us get into those rooms. It's always like magic when this bit happens. And see where you land and have a chat to those that you find yourself with about that question.
Yes.